Well, hey, everybody. My name's Scott. This is my friend Nathan. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. We like to take books that we've been reading and relate them to recovery. We both work with the care ministry here at Christ Community Church, and in particular, Celebrate Recovery, and which we invite you to if you're looking for a community to be part of in which you are invited to be open and honest in as much as you feel comfortable with about the things you're facing in life in a safe place. That is what we try to create here on Monday nights at 7 o'clock. We meet in the Hub, which is our student center. You're welcome to join us. We're in Westchester, Pennsylvania. With that in mind, the current book that we are working through, which is a fascinating one, is called The Body Keeps the Score, and it's by Dr. van der Kolk. And this book is heavy in many ways, emotionally so. He dives into the neuroscience, which tends to come up a lot in the books that we've been reading anyway, and the conversations. And so today, this is our fourth video on this book, and it is we're taking a look at chapter 3, which is called Looking into the Brain, the Neuroscience Revolution. Looking into the Brain, the Neuroscience Revolution. So, Nathan, we were just talking about this chapter. It's pretty amazing as it relates to recovery. So why don't you start? I know it gets into some of the parts of the brain here. And
well, I think the first is just the background of how recent all of this is. It starts off by saying, only since the 90s, which would have been really the beginning of being able to see certain, imaging pictures, things like that for the brain itself. And he says, for the first time, we could watch the brain as it processed memories, sensations, emotions, and begin to map the circuits of mind and consciousness. And of course that they're doing that basically to somewhat solve the puzzle, to have the scientific research that is backing up things that some we know because of trial and error, and some because of just other areas medically that has helped. But I know that you and I like talking about the neuroscience because it is a fascinating thing to solidify some of the things that we know about, like Celebrate Recovery, things that we know why we're doing the things that we're doing, and just helping overcome. I think it overcomes some of the stigma of things too.
Yep. I believe
go ahead. What?
I'm sorry, keep going.
No, I was just saying, the stigma that when people are saying, oh, it's just all in your head, or, I get frightened by some of the things that I think about and makes me want to do, that they are basically feeling out of control, and it's a hard thing to admit. But when you're thinking, this is what's happening in the brain systems, this is why the body's responding to the brain, it starts to say, at least to me, like, I'm not crazy, right?
Yes.
And
I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it's the fMRI, the functional magnetic resonance imaging, that really advanced this topic, because that particular technology detects activity in the brain, I believe, is associated with blood flow. So if they put me in an fMRI and they ask me to relive a trauma, then they're able to see where the blood flow in my brain, what part of the brain it is going to. And that tells them something about what part of my brain was affected by that trauma.
Right.
So that's the fMRI, and that helped to advance this conversation.
Yeah, and not only affect, but areas that maybe should be affected but are not turned on, which and that tells them something as well. So the first thing that he is imaging, and I would equate it to like how advanced ultrasound has become. It used to be very black, white, and parents would not be able to see, like, what is that?
Right.
And to the point today where there's like 3D imaging of ultrasounds at this point, and that totally changes the dynamic, the way the image comes out. Because you're like, yeah, that's definitely the baby. Whereas before you're like trying to read clouds, right?
Yeah.
And the first element that he brings up is that trauma deactivates a specific part of the brain. They call it BRCA, I guess is how they say it, right?
Yes.
And that is the area where speech happens. And so I'm just going to read off this quote. Their bodies re-experience terror, rage, helplessness, as well as the impulse to fight or flee. But these feelings are almost impossible to articulate. Trauma by nature drives us to the edge of comprehension, cutting us off from language based on common experience or an imaginable past. Meaning the one, it's hard to talk about because your brain, it's hard for the brain to comprehend. It's not supposed to comprehend trauma, that we weren't made to go through trauma. And so it shuts down language because it's almost too intense of an experience to express in words. And we were just talking about, right? Group, the open share group, right?
At Celebrate Recovery, right? So if you sit in a group and you're invited in a safe place where there is, even getting down to some of the minutia of our guidelines for being in the group, you're not allowed to interrupt somebody when they're talking.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to try and fix them. You're not allowed to give them advice. You're only allowed to sit there and listen. And when they're done, simply say, thank you for sharing. And it's a confidential setting because everybody agrees up front that unless somebody has threatened to hurt themselves or somebody else, they're free to speak. And so in a safe place, I'm invited. Now, it's not counseling. We wouldn't call it therapy per se, but recognizing it for what it is, there is something very powerful when I can come and share a traumatic experience and see others are looking at me.
Yeah.
They're not getting up and running out of the room. They're accepting me where I'm at. And I'm able to relive this perhaps trauma that I've been through.
Yeah.
And I've never put words to that before.
Yeah. And not only that, but they're going to be mirroring proper emotions too. So you might be feeling fear or shame. And really what is on the faces of the people in the open share group would be love, compassion, a sense of acceptance, at least from someone outside, being able to be objective. And those are the things that we're trying to re-mirror our emotions and let our emotions follow what we're seeing. So that means open share groups is really powerful because this is part of the healing journey.
Quick example, what you just said. Just this past week, I was sitting in a group and one man was sharing his story as it related to his childhood. And it was powerful in the sense of it was hard to hear. It was about trauma. And I obviously won't share any details, but I will say I felt it as he spoke. And then I noticed somebody across from him was starting to cry because his story was so powerful that it affected him. And so imagine telling
Yeah.
your story, which maybe you've never given words to, and all of a sudden the person listening to you is emotionally impacted to the point where they're crying on your behalf.
And that can be healthy, because if you've not been able to cry and grieve, having someone grieve in front of you gives you another appropriate response. It kind of is someone leading you through their emotional response, and you can just follow along.
Yeah.
So
I think that's so interesting. You pointed it out that trauma can shut down the speech area of our brains, which means we feel it deeply, but or at least it feels to us, so to speak, like we can't put words to it. And part of that is because that part of the brain shut down due to the trauma.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not just the speech. So moving on to the next section in this book is actually about the left and right side, which they said, we remember in the past people talking about people who are more right brain sided and left brain sided.
Mm-hmm.
But it is now saying, in terms of the scans that they have medically, they can see that it says images of past trauma activate the right hemisphere of the brain and deactivate the left. So again, if you can't remember, the two halves of the brain do speak different languages. So that's important to note, not like speech, but they're kind of speaking different languages. The right is intuitive, emotional, visual, tactual, like feeling. The left is linguistic, speech. It's sequential, so meaning it's ordered, it's analytical. And of course, a lot of that happens in the frontal lobe that we talked about, including the speech. So it means that when you're remembering trauma, the right side of the brain is fully there and the left side of the brain is not. And in fact, to the point where the brain can't tell the difference, that it's not happening around you anymore. It's literally happening to that part of the brain in real time.
Yeah. And I know in future chapters, he will touch on what's commonly called EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And I know that it has to do with activating both sides of the brain simultaneously. And if you're familiar with it, it could be somebody tapping on both of your knees at the same time while you tell your story.
Yeah.
It could be holding two devices in your hands that vibrate in a random pattern, and you telling your story. So the effort is to kind of revive those parts of the brain that were shut down during trauma.
Yeah, and so just to read off that piece, because now we're going to talk about step study.
Yes.
So he's saying having one side or the other of the brain shut down, even temporarily, or having one side cut off is very disabling. So basically, when the left side of the brain is shut down, it's saying that you have a hard time living present. So without sequencing the left side, we can't identify cause and effect, grasp the long-term effects of our actions, create coherent plans for the future. And for people like this, they can say that they are, quote, losing their mind because they lose the loss of executive functioning. So basically, a memory is happening. You're acting out in one way or the other. It could be an addiction. It could just be freeze or whatever. And you are stuck there because it's the left side of the brain that can create order from the memory and they kind of partner together to in fact move forward into not just the future, but the present moment. You're able to move past an incomprehensible memory, a trauma that basically just replays over and over. That can be as simple as a trigger. So many different kinds of triggers can bring that memory up. But if it hasn't been connected to the left side, then you're going to just, boom, you're right back, whether it happened 10 years ago or 30 years ago, you'll go back there. And in fact, one of the last sentences, they had not integrated their experience into the ongoing stream of their life. Meaning it's almost a standalone, the trauma. They continued to be, quote, there, and did not know how to be, quote, here, fully alive in the present. So they're not even being fully alive because they're stuck living over and over a past thing, you know?
Yep. And again, in a recovery group such as Celebrate Recovery, you're sitting in a group, you're sitting with, not only are you telling your story, but you're listening to others tell their story. And so you, from a neurological point of view, you're inviting your brain. From a biblical point of view, we might say you're inviting your heart,
right,
or your soul, or your spirit, perhaps into the pain. The scriptures say, bear one another's burdens. Now that could mean that you asked me to come over to your office and pick up a book because you broke your hand and you can't carry it, and I could literally carry your burden.
Yeah.
Or it could mean I'm listening to you tell your story, and it's not part of it. The healing is you telling it, is freeing you. Part of it is me carrying it along with you in an emotional sense.
Right. Like the guy who cried, that would be carrying burden, because now you're, I mean, like the statistics for people who have had trauma is like 7 or 8 out of 10 people have some kind of trauma, whether it's physical, sexual, mental, whatever.
Right.
Which means the vast majority of us are carrying around trauma. And to this chapter's point, trauma to us is incomprehensible, which means only in a community context can it become comprehensible, movable, healable as well.
Yeah.
And like step study, even moving to the future towards a normal, a new normal again, which isn't just a recurring, you know, a repeating, like a record that just keeps, you know, back when people played records.
Yes. So let's wrap it up. And I would say there's something very powerful. First of all, neurologically, the way God has wired our brains. And I think of Psalm 139, 13 and 14. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. I also think of 1 Corinthians 10 that tells us not to forsake getting together. Now, if we read that on the surface, it might sound like, well, somebody's going to take my attendance, and so I need to be at church. But if you think way, way below that, there's something very powerful about being with others in a safe place, sharing your story in the Christian setting, believing that Christ, not only am I engaged with your story, Christ is also there beside you, with you, in you, hearing you tell your story and bringing healing far beyond what I can.
Yeah, it's not just good and healthy. It's transformative. So
that's right. Okay. Well, we will leave chapter 3 there. And next time, of course, we'll go on
Yes.
to chapter 4. So thanks for spending this time with us. A lot going on in this chapter.
Yeah.
And we look forward to having you back next time.
All right. See you guys.
See you later. Take care.